Bro, Thierry Henry saying I was depressed is not some casual confession. Like he's basically telling us the Stoic legend had constant emotional weight. And the wild part is he connects it to one thing, pleasing his dad. Your dad giving you a mission at 5 or 6 sounds sweet on paper. But when it becomes approval only, it turns into a prison, instantly. The what I didn't do thing, that's like a psychological alarm system. Yeah, your brain learns to scan for failure even while winning trophies. Do you notice how he says he didn't even know love was missing? Because people hear not affectionate and think, okay, rough childhood. But he's describing emotional illiteracy, no tools to talk, hug, process. And now look at him, hugging his mom is weird. That's real trauma residue. The most interesting thread is identity. He says the athlete dies after retirement. That's such a clean way to describe depression after a career ends, right? When your validation is performance, then silence becomes terrifying. He even compares it to being incarcerated or military, adjusting to normal life. That's the part nobody tells you when you're chasing the dream. He talks about the cape, like you wear it to survive the gaze of others. And when the cape comes off, you're exposed, hurt, weakness, human mess. Also, cap on, cap off is basically his mental health mechanism. Do you think that's healthy coping or just avoidance with a nicer outfit? I lean avoidance because he says putting it on feels like a lie. But at the same time, during high pressure, you need something that works immediately. So it's not either or. It becomes a coping strategy that later needs replacing. I wasn't playing well, divorcing. I'm letting everyone down. That spiral is brutal. He says he couldn't ask for help, which is so telling. Like he wants someone to notice, but he also wants to be invisible. That's the people-pleaser contradiction, craving empathy, fearing judgment. And he connects leadership to vulnerability and empathy as the missing pieces. That's my favorite part. He's basically saying the greatest leaders feel safe enough to be human. But in locker rooms, vulnerability was taboo. He's describing the cost of that culture. Exactly. If you can't admit I'm not okay, then everyone pretends until they break. He also says vulnerability isn't weakness, it's how teams relate. And he's like, you can go places when your team knows you're relatable. I'm thinking about his childhood, leaving home at 13, elite academy, constant selection. That's not growing up, it's permanent evaluation, like every day is a tryout. Claire Fontaine as the SAS of football sounds intense, but emotionally it's costly. Do you buy his claim that childhood exposure makes you or breaks you? I do, because he shows both outcomes. He becomes elite, but the human part is starved. He literally says the athlete got fed, but the human being got almost nothing. And then the kids re-educate him, like parenting is therapy you did not plan. He says kids open doors he didn't know how to deal with, love as a new skill. That's the subtle message. You can't blame yourself for lacking tools you were never taught. But you can build them later, and he's trying, still connecting with the little man. I like that he admits it's ongoing, it's not a fixed-it story. Also, the detail about scoring 6 and still getting criticized. He can detect his dad's energy instantly. That's emotional GPS, you win, but the signal is still not enough. It makes me wonder, was he depressed from the start, or did pressure just activate existing wiring? He said depression, but the transcript is also about suppression and relentless performance. Either way, the mechanism is similar. No room for joy unless it proves worth. And that I never celebrated goals thing, stoicism as a mask, not personality. He smiles on assists because the giver gets less scrutiny, maybe? That matches what you said earlier in the segment. People-pleasing and empathy can coexist. He's basically describing heightened sensitivity to emotions in rooms where he learned to watch. And then the funniest line conceptually is, when I stopped competing, I felt naked. Imagine telling your brain, we're done after 20 years of non-stop purpose. So what do we take from this practically? Therapy, vulnerability, new identity? I think the big takeaway is, success doesn't cancel unprocessed childhood patterns. And also, leadership is empathy plus vulnerability, not just grit and control. Because control works until it doesn't, and then the pain shows up anyway. Next time I see a stoic genius, I'll ask what coping mechanism he's wearing. Anyway, this episode is a reminder that the real game is emotional. All right, we're wrapping here. This conversation was intense in the best way. Episode 2 is going deeper into what happens after the cape comes off, how people rebuild. The cape idea is insane, like you can feel hurt yet still perform. And the weird part is it works, until your body files a complaint. "I'm fine" is such a professional athlete sentence, huh? He literally learned worth from outcomes, not from being a person. That's why trophies don't soothe the kid inside. You can't hug a statue. Do you think he ever consciously chose people-pleasing, or it just auto-ran? Because it sounded like approval never granted became the default setting. I hate how early it starts. Like at 13, you're already bargaining for love. And he's honest that it wasn't hell, it was just emotionally starved. That's the part people miss. You can have safety and still have trauma. How did that translate into leadership later? Empathy and vulnerability, right? Yeah, he basically reverse-engineered the absence. I lacked tools, so I got them. But do you buy that empathy is learned only from pain? I buy that pain teaches urgency. Empathy can still be a choice after that. Vulnerability is taboo in a dressing room is so brutally real. Everyone wants you strong until you're human, then it's suddenly, "Why are you like this?" His line about rage being easy because it's fuel from missed expectations. That's such a pattern. Anger is an emotion with a job description. When he said affection was weird, I felt that in my bones. Because you can be successful and still not know how to receive comfort. And then the transition, career ends, identity ends, and suddenly the room is silent. That silence comparison is brutal, like you're untrained for stillness. It makes sense why he said the competitor dies. Your survival strategy stops serving you. Okay, but what does processing actually look like for someone like that? Because therapy is mentioned, but the lived habit is perform, distract, avoid. So the practical step is learning to pause before you interpret feelings as weakness. Like your brain says, hurt detected, immediately put on cape. And the cape isn't fake. It's protective armor that outlives its usefulness. But protection becomes a cage when you're no longer allowed to take it off. Do you think he had to unlearn celebrating too, stoic face, never goal joy? The joy was reserved for assists because giving was safer than receiving. That's a huge clue. His nervous system trusted impact more than connection. Even his party logic, Euro next, stop celebrating, sounds like anxiety in sports clothing. I didn't go to the party because the next thing is coming. That's not calm, that's prepping. Then in Barcelona, divorce, injury, new language, everything hits at once. He basically said the cape made it feel like nobody could see he was hurt, which is heartbreaking because he also wanted someone to notice, yet couldn't ask. That contradiction is so real, wanting help while fearing the vulnerability that help requires. And his fear wasn't, "I'll fail at football," it was, "I won't be a good dad." That's why success didn't heal. His core wound kept shifting targets, not stopping. Also the line about kids re-educating him, like he's learning affection through parenting. Kids are basically emotional boot camp instructors who can't be bribed with trophies. I like that he's not glorifying suffering, he's extracting tools and making peace later. If you had to name the pattern, it's approval, performance, identity, collapse. But we should also admit, performance did build him, even if it trapped him. Exactly. Trauma can coexist with excellence. It just hijacks the emotional wiring. So the question becomes, can you become world-class without becoming emotionally illiterate? And that's where vulnerability as leadership comes in. Empathy breaks the cycle. Still, it's scary how long it takes to connect the dots as an adult. Do you think people-pleasing ever fully ends, or it just becomes more conscious? Conscious awareness is already a win because autopilot isn't destiny anymore. All right, we've got to breathe, because the cape image will stay with me. We'll pick this up even deeper in episode 2, especially what happens once the cape comes off. Thanks for sitting with us through all that emotion. See you in the next one. Episode 2, The Rebuilding Phase, Identity After Applause and Learning to Be at Home. People-pleasing doesn't feel like a trait to me here. It feels like survival. And when you said cape, I instantly pictured identity fused with performance. Like you don't just play football, you manage other people's emotions all day. That's exhausting, and the scary part is you learn it young. Wait, he's basically describing depression-adjacent behavior without using the label early. But I also wonder, does depression get simplified when people explain it later? When he says, "I was crying almost every day," that's not just sadness, right? The trophies are winning, but the internal weather is still storming. The most painful line was, "The little me never heard approval." Because if approval never lands, you'll keep hunting it forever. So when you're scoring 6 goals and you still feel unsafe, what is that even? That car silence after a 6-0 match, bro, that would rewire your nervous system. Like your brain learns, success doesn't mean safety. Exactly. So the cape becomes a tool to simulate safety for everyone. And vulnerability is leadership. This is the antidote, but it's uncomfortable at first. But real question, can people-pleasing be healed or only managed? Does conscious awareness stop the behavior, or just help you notice it faster? My take, it reduces the autopilot, but your body still remembers the old threat. The body is like, cool, you understand now, but we're still bracing. That's why connecting dots as an adult can take years, honestly. He also said the human part was missing. What does that even mean day to day? It means you're trained to perform, not to feel, not to talk, not to soften. Even hugging your mom felt weird, like affection didn't come with instructions. And that happens when love is conditional, or expressed only as correction. Did you catch the part where affection was basically, you didn't do enough? That's wild because it turns mistakes into identity, not just errors. And then he grows into a man who can analyze every detail because attention was demanded. What I didn't do mattered becomes a lifetime algorithm. So when the cape goes on, he's not hiding weakness, he's hiding need. He even said he wanted people to see he's hurt, but he didn't want to ask for help. That sounds contradictory, but it's actually very consistent with trauma logic. Because asking for help felt like risking rejection or failing the role again. So you'd rather perform the hurt away than risk being emotionally exposed. Then Barcelona comes in and the cape stops working because life breaks the script. Divorce, new language, injury, new team. Everything threatens the old identity at once. And he says even when he puts the cape on, it still feels like a lie. That's the worst, knowing you're acting but having no other option. I'm thinking about that "I'm letting everyone down" loop he described. It's not just guilt, it's omnidirectional responsibility. Omnidirectional responsibility is basically people-pleasing on steroids. But also, how does a performer survive emotionally with that kind of load? By dissociating into the athlete's self, like he said, you know what to do. Athlete mode is a treadmill, fast, focused, and never enough. And then he says, when you stop the athlete, you die. That's intense. It's not literal death, but the identity collapse is real and brutal. Which is why he compares it to incarceration or war returning, shock to the system. So the cape comes off and suddenly there's silence, feelings, and reality. And silence is terrifying when you were never taught how to sit with yourself. That's where his kids come in, re-educating him into being human. I love that framing. My children saved me every day. It's like the next relationship teaches him empathy that his upbringing didn't transmit. And now his leadership style has vulnerability built into it, not punished. Do you think he learned empathy because he suffered? Or because he finally stopped trying to earn love? Because that stop earning shift is subtle, but it changes everything. If your worth is always negotiated, you never fully relax into who you are. Exactly. Relaxation becomes the hardest part, not the training. So the cape isn't bravery, it's conditional safety wearing fabric. And the growth is learning that you can be seen while still surviving the feelings. Next time we get into this, I want to talk about what happens when approval stops being currency. Because that's when the real rebuilding starts. After the applause, before the cape returns. Bro, the cape thing is actually terrifyingly accurate for adults too. Like you perform, then you go home and realize nobody knows the real damage. He said when the cape is off, thoughts just start interrogating you, right? Yeah, it's like your brain becomes a hostile commentator. But I'm still stuck on one thing. Was it learned or was it destiny? Because trauma can shape you, but intent still matters a bit, no? He talks like his dad implanted a training schedule inside his nervous system. And the crazy part is the kid grows up thinking, this is love somehow. That's the most expensive misunderstanding in the world. When he says rage is easy, because it feeds the didn't do enough wiring, that hit. Anger fuels action, sadness fuels silence, and silence is scary for people like that. So if you never learned affection, you can't just switch on tenderness later. He literally said hugging his mom feels weird even now. That's such a small sentence, but it carries decades of muscle memory. Do you think Arsenal and the trophies could have made him happier if the foundation changed? I think trophies can decorate the trauma, not cure it. Right, because he's still chasing the look on his dad's face, not his own peace. The Invincibles era, and he's still living in a silent car ride, basically. And then people ask, were you happy? Like happiness is a scoreboard number. He gives the answer every trauma kid hates. You can't even tell the difference. I like how he distinguished athlete identity versus human identity. That athlete dies when you stop competing line is brutal, but it's also freeing. It's basically your coping mechanism became your entire personality. But I wonder, is there a version of him where the coping turns into strength without the pain? He kinda answered that, vulnerability and empathy as the missing leadership tools. Which is interesting because people-pleasing can look like empathy from far away. But it's not empathy if you're only managing emotions to stay safe. It's compliance dressed up as care. Cape on can mean, I'll be lovable, don't abandon me, not I'm brave. Exactly, conditional safety-wearing fabric, not courage in the open. When he says he learned empathy late, that implies his early model was emotional absence. Like affection wasn't taught, so he became good at noticing gaps and flaws instead. Attention to detail is just hypervigilance with better branding. You walk into a room and scan what you didn't do. That's not a personality, that's survival. Then when the environment changes, divorce, Barcelona, language, survival methods break. And you can't just translate your coping from one life to another. The way he described fans, teammates, press, everyone seeing only the player, not the hurt. That's public performance as emotional dissociation. And then the shame comes. You're letting your daughter down, you're letting yourself down. The guilt stack is insane because it's layered. Marriage, identity, performance. Do you think he truly believed he caused it, or was it the only story his brain could afford? People-pleasing brains don't do complex, they do, I must be at fault. That's why rest matters. If you don't rest, the cape never comes off cleanly. Rest becomes permission to feel, and feeling is where trauma lives. It's like his calendar had training, but not emotional downtime. And then adulthood tries to give you a normal life. You're basically under-equipped. Imagine being released from the institution, and nobody teaches you silence. Silence is where your old wiring starts talking loudest. I also love the analogy. He could compete forever, but he couldn't return to the old part of him. Like a competitive self can't fully coexist with a normal self without grief. So what's the actual antidote? Vulnerability first, or approval stops being currency first? I think approval first has to die a little, otherwise vulnerability is just another performance. Vulnerability can become people-pleasing too. I'm vulnerable, please validate me. Exactly. Real rebuilding is when nobody is paying you in praise anymore. And then you have to learn what you actually like, not what you're supposed to like. That's the painful part, learning to want without fear. He said the little man is still waiting for approval even now, so that wound doesn't fully vanish. So the win is not never feel it, it's don't obey it automatically. And that's why empathy becomes leadership, because you stop using people to patch emptiness. You stop being a professional at earning love. I swear, this story makes you rethink every I'm fine you've ever performed. All right, we'll leave it there for today. This cape theme needs another round. Tomorrow, we're going even deeper into what happens after approval stops being currency. If this episode landed, sit with that feeling for a second, then watch your own patterns. We'll catch you in episode 2, where the cape starts breaking in public, not just in private. That part about I'm fine just hits different, right? Yeah, because he's basically describing emotional theater. Like the cape is coping, but it also becomes a cage. Exactly. When he says, put the cape on, you can feel the performance panic. And the terrifying part is how automatic it is. People think trauma makes you weird, but it also makes you very efficient. The people-pleasing isn't even nice, it's survival math. He's describing worth being traded for approval, then replaced by trophies. The whole golden boot, invincibles, still chasing dad thing is brutal. Because you'd assume success would heal the original wound. But the brain learns. Success only buys permission to keep going. When he talks about missing affection, that's the root, right? Not the football. Football just became the delivery system for the unmet need. And I love how he says rage was easy, but sadness was complicated. That is so real. Anger has a script. Grief feels unlicensed. Don't cry, be strong. That teaches you to cry quietly inside. Then in Barcelona, the cape goes on because fans can't see the injury. And also because he doesn't want help, but wants someone to understand anyway. That contradiction is the whole addiction loop. Hide pain, crave recognition. He says he was letting everybody down, fans, daughter, friends, even himself. That's guilt dressed as duty, wearing a captain's armband. Imagine scoring goals and still feeling like you failed a group project. I'm wondering, does the cape break privately first, then publicly? Or does the public version of you break the private one over time? He kinda implies both. Cape on equals numb, cape off equals collapse. The human being is missing almost everything, so the athlete overcompensates. What did you hear as the most controversial bit? Die when you stop competing. That line is extreme, but I get it. Identity fusion is dangerous. When your life is structured around performance, silence becomes terrifying. It's like retirement is an identity death, not just a schedule change. And he compares it to not knowing how to be at home, like being a guest. That's such a sharp metaphor. You arrive home as a visitor to yourself. Also, the leadership part, vulnerability and empathy, felt like a late upgrade. Yeah, he's basically saying, I was strong but not emotionally safe. The weird part is the world rewards strong and penalizes I'm hurting. In sport, especially then, emotion is taboo, so you learn to conceal. Now the question is, how do you unlearn concealment without losing performance? Because you can't just remove the cape, you have to replace the skill it served. Like people-pleasing served him to stay alive and get accepted. Then later, it serves him again by making him a reliable machine under pressure. But the price is you never learn how to say I feel without negotiating first. That access was never granted line is heartbreaking. He's describing a childhood where love was conditional on results. And now he's trying to connect with the little man stuck in that system. That makes sense. Self-improvement isn't just new habits, it's old wiring. I also like the part where he credits his kids for re-educating him. Yeah, like fatherhood becomes therapy with sneakers on. He learns affection by practicing it, not by receiving a neat instruction. Which is annoying because we want healing to be immediate and cinematic. Do you think his empathy evolved because he hit the edge of collapse? Probably. When the cape stops working, you start listening to the person underneath. And the greatest leader formula becomes real. Vulnerability plus empathy equals trust. Trust is basically the opposite of people-pleasing, finally choosing yourself. So where does this land for the listener? What should they notice in their own life? Watch when your success feels hollow, because that's the cape talking again. And watch when you feel guilty for resting, because guilt replaced affection. The body always remembers the old contract even after you win the deal. I keep thinking, if trophies were medicine, everyone like him would be healed. But trophies are like painkillers. Mask the sensation, don't remove the cause. Next episode, we should go after the exact moment the cape breaks in public. Because that's when people finally learn, or they double down harder. All right, let's leave it there. This cape theme needs another round. In episode 2, we'll dig into what happens after approval stops being currency. The cape metaphor is insane, like identity armor. He's basically saying, perform, then collapse privately. And the scary part is you don't even notice the collapse starting. Society keeps clapping while the guy is quietly buffering. But tell me, is it avoidance or is it survival training? Because those are different addictions, bro. He makes it sound like his early home didn't teach affection. So affection got replaced by metrics, what you didn't do. That line about what I didn't do mattered is basically trauma in KPI form. And then football becomes the one language that still earns approval. It's wild how performance can become a substitute family. Then when football ends, the whole identity contract expires instantly. I relate to that guest in your own home feeling. Like you're visiting yourself and charging rent. The way he compares it to soldiers or prisoners acclimatizing back, yeah. Because in the institutions, you always had noise and purpose. After, silence shows you what you've been running from. And he calls vulnerability and empathy the missing leadership tools. I know that's true, but it's also brutally hard in that culture. Imagine telling a locker room, hey guys, I'm not okay back then. Everyone would diagnose you like it's fantasy football. That's why his cape works. It hides weakness from the tribe. But at Barcelona, the cape starts failing. He's injured, divorcing, adapting. And the worst symptom he names is, everything was a no. Like even your inner monologue is coaching you to lose. He's letting down everyone, daughter, fans, friends, and he can't repair it through performance. That's such a cruel loop for people pleasers, no win condition. Because the whole training is, do more, be better, please harder. But depression doesn't care how hard you grind. What I'm wondering is, did he stop enjoying the game while he was still winning? He said trophies weren't the point, but also he chased approval anyway. That contradiction is the whole tragedy. Success doesn't feel like safety. Stoic goal celebrations are basically an emotional withdrawal plan. And the smile on assists, like I can be warm only when the spotlight shifts. It's like affection only counted when it wasn't risky. That's why the people-pleaser framework hits comedians too. It's the same root wound. Though I want to push back slightly, empathy can't be an add-on later. If you never learned affection, you need relearning, not just realization. He talks about kids re-educating him though, so maybe that's the bridge. That's the part I actually love, parenthood as unlearning. He says the kids open doors he didn't know existed. Basically, trauma doesn't end, but your feedback loop changes. Still, the fear of not being a good dad line, damn. He's not saying divorce is sin, he's saying guilt becomes a governing system. And guilt loves to drive the steering wheel with no brakes. I also noticed he treats rest like a moral failure. That's exactly what we were circling earlier. Affection replaced by guilt. So the cape isn't just pride, it's a coping mechanism that blocks real needs. But I wonder, can coping mechanisms ever become healthier without breaking first? He basically says, at some point, you die when the athlete identity stops. That's intense wording, but it matches the feeling of sudden emptiness. Like your operating system gets uninstalled and you're still trying to run old apps. And then you learn slowly that you can be a human, not just a performer. I'd love to zoom into one moment, the first day he realizes the cape is hurting me. Not when he's breaking in private, when he's forced to face everyone's eyes. Because public failure is where people-pleasers get their worst dopamine and worst panic. It's like, finally, you get the truth, but it costs your nervous system. All right, we've got enough cape damage for one episode. Let's actually let people sit with it. Next time, we follow the moment the cape breaks in public. And then we ask, do you double down, or do you finally choose help? See you in episode 2. Same energy, more receipts. Teaser. Episode 2 is about approval stopping being currency. What you do when it crashes. Bro, the cape metaphor is so brutal, like it works until it doesn't. He's basically saying, I can only be safe when I'm performing. And the scary part is, he didn't even call it sadness, he called it hurt. Do you notice how people-pleasers often translate feelings into action? Like, I'm not crying, I'm scoring 6 goals. The dad is the gatekeeper of worth, even when the kid is winning trophies. That's the toxic part. Approval doesn't show up, so nothing lands. Exactly, he's invincible on the pitch and still starving off it. It's like the nervous system never got the memo that the job is done. When you hear him say vulnerability was taboo in the dressing room, yeah. Because taboo doesn't just stop tears, it stops repair. That line about you'd rather be the athlete than the human hit hard. That's identity fusion. Yourself stops being yours and becomes your role. And then retirement is basically withdrawal. No cape, no cover, no job. It reminds me of how some people crash after they finally achieve. Congrats, you reached the goal. Cool. Why do I feel empty now? He's also describing growing up with a microscope. You notice what's wrong fast. Like his superpower is also his prison, attention to details from rejection. That's why he says empathy and vulnerability became missing leadership tools. I love that he realized leadership isn't just execution, it's emotional permission. But even then, he's late to it, because early context wires you differently. And look at the contrast. Affection wasn't modeled at home. So he learned to show love as productivity. Perform, then you're safe. When I hug my mom is weird, that's such an honest sentence. That's not comedy. That's a body remembering what it never practiced. Do you think the cape is also a way to protect others from his pain? Yeah, he kind of says it. He wants help, but doesn't want to admit weakness. It's like, please notice I'm bleeding, but don't look too hard. That's such a human contradiction, and elite athletes are still human. The Barcelona part was the perfect case study. Divorce, injury, new language, new team. And he's basically saying, I couldn't be a person in that moment. Because if the cape comes off, people see hurt instead of work rate. People don't dock points for emotional overload. Apparently, they dock your career. So his brain chooses the only known survival strategy. Put the cape on. I'm curious, though, did he ever believe he was unhappy, or was he just confused? He said he didn't ask, was I happy? He asked, did I do what was required? That's terrifyingly efficient, like a robot with a human backstory. The dopamine is chasing approval, but the anxiety is never satisfied. And he admits it's still there. The little man is still waiting for approval. So the trauma doesn't disappear when you win, it just changes outfits. I like that the kids re-educate him. He learns love by giving it, not performing it. That's growth. Turning the wiring outward instead of keeping it inward. Still, it's a reminder that healing is slower than careers. Athletes understand training. They don't always understand emotional training. The real lesson is, performance can mask pain, but it can't solve it. And for anyone listening, if your identity is your output, you're one off-season away. All right, I'm glad we got to sit with that cape damage together. Because next time, we're watching the cape break in public. What people choose after that. Will they double down on pleasing or finally choose help? Catch us in Episode 2, same energy and more receipts. Teaser. Episode 2 is about approval stopping being currency. What you do when it crashes.